Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's talk over Zoom through the East Hampton Library. And today we have back with us, we have journalist Evan Weiner, who is going to give a little overview of what is now 40 years ago, the year 1984, its highlights, its big events, and I could see from the first picture there, is that Muhammad Ali?
No, that's Marcus Allen, who was
Marcus Allen.
the MVP of the Super Bowl when
So,
the
oh,
Los
yeah.
Angeles Raiders won.
Excellent, excellent.
And
Without,
behind him this was sponsored by Sport Magazine. And I don't know if you caught it today or not, but somebody finally put Sports Illustrated into the ground. It's been dead for years. Nobody's noticed it, but they finally announced that Sports Illustrated is no longer with us.
well, without further ado, turn over the talk to Evan Weiner.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for showing up tonight. It's kind of miserable where I am right now. I'm close to Manhattan. But let's talk about 1984, and that is me, and that is Marcus Allen, who was the MVP of the Super Bowl, where the Los Angeles Raiders won. There was also the book 1984, which had nothing to do with 1984. There was the presidential race between Ronald Reagan that year, and he was up against who was he up against? Well, we'll find out in a minute. The Cold War, the Olympic boycott, the Hong Kong handover took place that year. The Iran-Iraq War, and there is Donald Rumsfeld over there. It was Walter Mondale who lost to Ronald Reagan. Gandhi is assassinated, Indira Gandhi. And goodbye, Ma Bell. It's the end of long distance telephone service, and it's the end of an era. Goodbye, Ma Bell. And that is a computer from those days, the Macintosh. How many of you remember the Macintosh? Anyway, I think I had a version of the Macintosh. There was the British coal miners' strike that took place, and the deadly leak in India of chemicals, and space exploration, HIV discovery that took place that year. Miss America loses her crown. That was Vanessa Williams, who unfortunately, for a couple extra bucks, posed naked, and those pictures somehow ended into Penthouse magazine after she was Miss America. And who are you going to call? Ghostbusters. It's 1984, but Big Brother wasn't watching, although you might say that Big Brother is watching today if you walk around with one of these. And George Orwell, Big Brother's father. It wasn't 1984 when that book came out. In June of 1949, 1984 was published to critical acclaim. The primary theme of 1984 by George Orwell is to warn residents of the dangers of, readers rather, of the dangers of totalitarianism. The central focus of the book is to convey the extreme level of control and power possible under a truly totalitarian regime. It explores how such a government system would impact society and the people who live in it. But 1984, George Orwell's 1984, was just the book. Reagan, Walter Mondale, the presidential race. The incumbent Ronald Reagan faced only token opposition in his bid for renomination by the Republicans. Reagan and the vice president, George H.W. Bush, were easily renominated. The former vice president, Walter Mondale, got his party's nomination. He would make a really big mistake, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Mondale would make history by choosing U.S. Representative Geraldine Ferraro from Queens, New York, as his running mate. She would be the first woman to be on a major party's presidential ticket. Democratic primaries, well, the people who were involved: Jesse Jackson, Reuben Askew, George McGovern, Walter Mondale, Ellen Cranston, John Glenn, Gary Hart, Ernest Hollings. They're all up in New Hampshire. They're in Iowa for the caucuses. Hart came in second in the Iowa caucuses and won the New Hampshire primary. Quick to spot what seemed to be a trend, the inside Washington media all but wrote off Mondale. Less said about the insiders in Washington, in my case, the better off we are. No longer the front runner, Mondale abandoned his defensive stance, borrowing a slogan from a television commercial for a hamburger chain, Wendy's. You might remember Clara Peller. Where's the beef? He found a way to deflate Hart's pretensions as the candidate of new ideas and got the nomination. And there's Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. Down 16 points in the polls when Mondale named Ferraro his vice presidential pick, the excitement surrounding the nomination gave the new ticket a big bounce, bringing the polling to nearly even with the Republican challengers, the incumbent Ronald Reagan and his running mate, the incumbent vice president, George H.W. Bush, who in those days was just George Bush. The Mondale-Ferraro ticket attempted without success to find an issue that would resonate with voters. Fairness between rich and poor, alleged misbehavior by Reagan's aides, Reagan's close ties with aggressive fundamentalist groups all failed to dent the approval ratings of the man supporters called the Great Communicator. He was an actor after all. And I interviewed him in 1980 in Bear Mountain when he was running for president. And he could get right to the point. He could tell a joke. He could, on command, because he was an actor. And I was impressed at how quickly he could turn on a dime. But again, he was an actor and went into politics. And enemies called him the Teflon president because no charges ever stuck to him. And she has a problem, Geraldine Ferraro. She was a 3-term congresswoman from New York, and it was hoped that her nomination would galvanize the campaign. It did initially, but the Democratic ticket was derailed almost immediately by a month-long controversy over the finances of Ferraro and her husband, a New York real estate operator by the name of John Zuccaro. Zuccaro would not permit her to release his business records. Campaigning with a grim smile, Geraldine Ferraro joked that women married to Italian men know what it is like. Ferraro acknowledged that she and her accountants had been sloppy in handling the paperwork for some of their financial transactions. But I never, ever had any authority to sign checks or any authority as far as the corporation is concerned. She dragged down the ticket. Reagan's first years in office were plagued by bad financial news, but the economy was growing by 1984. 1983, economists were calling quits for President Reagan's stagflation as it grew in numbers, unseen since the Great Depression between 1929 and 1941. Mondale campaigned on the promise of freezing nuclear arms production while the Cold War raged. He was an advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was passed at that point about 12 years earlier and out to the states to vote whether or not they wanted it. Reagan was folksy. Yeah, he told a joke, and he pined for the good old days. And in my time with him, I had a half hour with him in 1980, because nobody showed up at Bear Mountain, because it was a day like today. It was 6 degrees with snow, and there were like 8 people there at this fundraiser. He hadn't caught fire yet, and he told me all about the days he recreated Chicago Cubs baseball games on WHO radio in Des Moines, Iowa. And he basically told me I made things up as I went because we'd have gaps in the communications between Chicago and Des Moines. Raising taxes. And this is where Walter Mondale makes a fatal mistake. By the end of my first term, I will reduce the Reagan budget deficit by 2/3. Let's tell the truth. It must be done. It must be done. Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did. This pledge to raise taxes, of course, backfired, because what politician is going to tell you, I'm going to raise taxes? And it gave the Republicans, the consultants and the image makers, along with Reagan, a lot of ammunition in their desire to paint the Democratic ticket as tax and spend liberals. Presidential debates, and there is Ronald Reagan, and there is Walter Mondale. And take a close look at the top of that picture. 1984 presidential debates, League of Women Voters. It would be the last time League of Women Voters would sponsor the presidential debates, because they said in 1988 they could not any longer live with the rules imposed on them by both the Democratic and Republican parties. The parties were calling the shots, and they wanted to know the questions that were going to be asked. First debate was limited to domestic policy. The second debate focused on international policy and national defense. In the first debate, Mondale was viewed as the more effective speaker, and Reagan was said to have appeared tired and sometimes confused. In the second debate, Mondale failed to gain further ground, and Reagan successfully diffused the issue of his age during the second debate when he said, "I want you to know that I also will not make my age an issue of this campaign. I'm not going to exploit it for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." Again, Reagan knew how to read a script and knew how to tell a joke. He really did. So he wins easily. On November 6th, Reagan defeated Mondale, the Democratic candidate, winning 525 electoral votes, 58.8% of the popular vote. No other candidate in United States history up to that point matched Reagan's electoral vote in a single election. Reagan carried 49 of 50 states, making this the second election in the 20th century in which a party won 49 states. Mondale won only his home state of Minnesota with a 0.18% margin and the District of Columbia. Why did Reagan win? The thought was that Reagan Democrats, viewed as Southern whites and Northern blue-collar workers, voted for Reagan because they credited him with the economic recovery. They saw Reagan as strong on national security issues and perceived the Democrats as supporting the poor and minorities at the expense of the middle class. It was the 1969 Richard Nixon silent majority voters, about 15 years later. Hong Kong is returned to China. The UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the Chinese Premier Zhou Ziyang signed the Sino-British joint declaration agreeing to return Hong Kong, British colony since 1842, to China in 1997. Hong Kong would become a special administrative region of China while maintaining a capitalist system. Konstantin Chernenko was the latest Soviet Union leader because of the death of Yuri Andropov. Chernenko was elected General Secretary in February, made chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet in April, and he also had health problems because these guys at that point were all in their late 70s, early 80s. He had failing health as well, and he was unable to fulfill his official duties. That is Los Angeles. That is Santa Monica, and the Soviet boycott of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Not too far from where I was standing in 1984. Soviet boycott of Los Angeles had its roots in 1978 and in 1979 and was a major part of the Cold War. Got to go back to 1978, the Afghanistan coup. The April Revolution, or the April coup, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan overthrew General Mohammed Daoud Khan on April 27th and 28th, 1978. Khan had taken power in the 1973 Afghan coup d'etat and established an autocratic one-party system in the country. Khan and most of his family were killed at the presidential palace by military officers in support of the PDPA. The revolution resulted in the creation of a Soviet-aligned government. The new government, which had little popular support, forged close ties with the Soviet Union, launched ruthless purges of all domestic opposition, and began extensive land and social reforms that were bitterly resented by the devoutly Muslim and largely anti-communist population. Soviets with the tanks there. Afghanistan and its subsequent one-party state run by the head of the Communist Party, Nur Muhammad Taraki, was extremely unpopular with the Afghan people, and the Soviets attempted to bolster it with the Soviet-Afghan Friendship Treaty of 1978. On December 24th, 1979, Christmas Eve, as midnight approached, the Soviets organized a massive military airlift into Kabul, involving an estimated 280 transport aircraft, 3 divisions of almost 8,500 men each. Within a few days, Soviets had secured the Afghan capital. Short order, nearly 100,000 Soviet soldiers took control of major cities and highways. The Mujahideen, the Afghan Mujahideen. On December 27, 1979, Babrak Karmel, the exiled leader of the Pashtun faction of the Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, was installed as Afghanistan's new head of government, and Soviet ground forces entered Afghanistan from the north. Factions of rebel fighters across the country began to unite to form the Mujahideen, a word that means those engaged in jihad in Arabic. The groups crossed ethnic and ideological lines, but initially they were defectors from the Afghan army, and they were funded by the United States and Pakistan. 1980 Olympics come along. That's my son. Many years ago with Jim Craig, who was the goaltender for the United States Olympic hockey team. That was at Rockefeller Center in 1985, 15 years after that event. The Carter Doctrine, which said the Soviets' attempt to gain control of Afghanistan and possibly the region was regarded as a threat to U.S. interests, and President Jimmy Carter was prepared to meet the threat with military force. Jimmy Carter's official announcement came on January 20th, 1980, in the form of an ultimatum on Meet the Press on NBC. By the way, that is the longest-running television show in American history. It started November 6, 1947. Unless the Soviets withdraw their troops within a month from Afghanistan, Carter would insist that the Olympic Games be moved from Moscow to an alternative site, or multiple sites, or postponed or canceled. USA, 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 that chant first heard in Lake Placid. It is February 24th, 1980, and the United States hockey team beat Finland to win the gold medal at the Lake Placid Olympics. An achievement, yes, but the American team 2 days earlier beat the Soviet Union in a game many didn't see or even know that it was being played. The Americans, made up of mostly college players, upset the heavily favored Soviet team, with the Cold War setting the stage. The Soviets set up shop in Afghanistan. The Olympics became a bigger than life stage. And there is the goal that put the Americans ahead. And there is Tretiak, the goaltender, who is rather upset. The hockey game took place on February 22nd, 1980. Because the Americans had won, the game took on a life of its own. It became known as the Miracle on Ice because of the ABC announcer Al Michaels' end-of-game call. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. The game was not seen live in the United States, except if you were in a border city and you got CBC from, say, Bellingham, Washington, all the way over to Presque Isle, Maine. It was the first game the USA, USA chant was ever heard. Carter called the team to congratulate them for beating the Soviets. It was only a game, but politically and culturally, it was the most significant sports matchup of the 20th century, all because of the Cold War. Should we boycott the Olympics? Newsweek, the Moscow Games. March 21st, 1980, President Jimmy Carter announces that the U.S. will boycott the Olympic Games scheduled to take place in Moscow that summer. The announcement came after the Soviet Union failed to comply with Carter's February 20th, 1980 deadline to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Products, grain as a weapon. Carter increased pressure on the Soviets to abandon the war in Afghanistan by issuing a trade embargo on 2 U.S. goods that the country desperately needed: grain and informational technology. He also restricted Soviet fishing in American-controlled ocean waters. The United States team, which consisted of more than 160 athletes, coaches, and support staff, could not compete in the Moscow Games. to further emphasize that he was meaning business and American athletes could not compete. Carter threatened to revoke the passport of any athlete who disobeyed his order. Well, the Soviet boycott. Carter did get other countries to follow his lead, but unable to persuade Britain, France, Greece, and Australia to go along with his policy. Canada, West Germany, and Japan joined the boycott. The initiative was a total failure. Well, the U.S. supports Afghan freedom fighters. There is Ronald Reagan there. The Afghan war quickly settled down into a stalemate with more than 100,000 Soviet troops controlling the cities, larger towns, and major garrisons, and the Mujahideen moving with relative freedom throughout the countryside. Soviet troops tried to crush the insurgency by various attacks, but the guerrillas generally eluded their attacks. The Soviets then attempted to eliminate the Mujahideen civil support by bombing and depopulating the rural areas. Soviet statement as the Olympics was approaching. It is known from the very first days of preparations for the present Olympics, the American administration has sought to set a course at using the Games for its political aims. Chauvinistic state sentiments and anti-Soviet hysteria are being whipped up in this country. Soviet officials went on to claim that the protests against the Soviet athletes were likely to break out in Los Angeles, and they doubted whether American officials would try to contain such outbursts. The Reagan administration responded by saying that the Soviet boycott was a blatant political decision for which there was no real justification. On May 8th, the Soviet Union announced that it would not compete in the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. The boycott response to the decision of the United States to boycott the 1980 Games that were held in Moscow. In the days following the Soviet announcement, 13 other communist nations, the Warsaw Pact countries, issued similar statements and refused to attend the Games. But the 1984 Olympics financially were successful, and that's the guy to my left in your picture, Shelley Saltman, passed away about 6 years ago. Shelley was part of the Olympics. He ran the boxing during the 1984 Olympics. I had a whole bunch of friends who were part of it, including my friend Renee Henry, who's up in Seattle, who went to the White House in 1977 with Peter Ueberroth and a lawyer by the name of John Argue, Argue. Is there a better name for a lawyer than Argue? Anyway, they went to Jimmy Carter looking for his support, and they really didn't get it. But Shelley filled me in on a lot of the details behind the scenes at the Olympics. The LA Olympics event was successful because the International Olympic Committee bent every one of its rules and was desperate to put on a good show in America after what happened in the 1970s when cities did not want the money-losing event. In fact, there were only two cities that bid for the 1984 Olympics: Los Angeles and Tehran, Iran, and they were going through some problems in Iran with the Shah at that time. Los Angeles was not required to build new structures such as an Olympic stadium. In fact, the committee constructed only one new venue, a Velodrome. Corporate money flowed into the event. Costs were kept down. There were volunteers, thousands of volunteers didn't get a penny, and the games did make money. According to David Simon, who was trying to get the 2012 Games for LA, and I got into a fight with him over the wisdom of this is the quote I got after he and I got into it. Anyway, David Simon was the guy who was the chairman of the LA committee looking to get the 2012 Olympics. He said, beyond the question of finances, the 1984 Games were enormously popular in Los Angeles. They proved to be a unifying force for the community to rally around. They provided hundreds of thousands of local residents with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to experience the Olympics as employees. There weren't very many employees, volunteers, thousands of volunteers, and spectators. The Games were widely considered to be one of, if not the greatest events in the city's history. The Games relied on volunteers, not employees, as a cost-cutting measure, and also a lot of corporate money. I'll give you a quick story. Peter Ueberroth, who ran the LA Olympics, was telling me that he wanted to get more money from Kodak. And he went up to Kodak in Rochester. They were just giving him $1 million. He said, I want more money. And they said, you're not getting it because nobody's going to give it to you. And he said, I'll show you. And he goes to Japan, talks to Fuji Films, and they said, we'll give you $5 million. Goes back to Rochester to talk to Kodak. He said, I got $5 million. They said, good luck to them. And Kodak was no longer an Olympic sponsor. That is Harry Usher. That's me on the right side, and that's Harry. That was from 1986. Harry was one of the brains behind the Olympics, and he was the nice guy compared to Peter Ueberroth. It would be Peter and Harry and Renee and Shelley and another one of my friends, Harvey Schiller, another guy, Rich Levin, who I knew, and Hal Uplinger, who hired me to do a sports radio network and then left me because he had a different job to do. He had to put together Live Aid in 1985. You and Eric Moffat will do a good job. Yeah, right. Anyway, but Hal and I stayed friends. The Olympics was drowning in the sea of red ink. Without competition from the Soviet Union, East Germany, and other communist nations, the United States won 83 gold medals, an Olympic record. Look, Ma, no hands. It is February 3rd, and the astronaut Bruce McCandless becomes the first man to take an untethered spacewalk. On August 30th, the third space shuttle Discovery was launched. In October, Catherine Sullivan became the first woman to walk in space. Well, there's another war going on right near Afghanistan. It's the Iran-Iraq war. Iraqi chemical attacks against Iran refers to chemical attacks used by the Iraqi armed forces against Iranian combatants and non-combatants. Reporter Michael Dobbs of the Washington Post stated that the Reagan administration was well aware that materials sold to Iraq would be used to manufacture chemical weapons for use in the war against Iran. He stated that Iraq's use of chemical weapons was hardly a secret, with the Iraqi military issuing this warning in February. The invaders should know that for every harmful insect, there is an insecticide capable of annihilating it, and Iraq possesses this annihilation insecticide. According to Reagan's foreign policy, every attempt to save Iraq was necessary and legal. And you had something else going on, the tanker war. That was launched when Iraq attacked Iran's oil terminal and oil tankers at Karg Island in the northern Persian Gulf. Iran responded by striking tankers, initially from Kuwait and later from other nations that ferried Iraqi oil. The U.S. withdrew from Lebanon, or is it more like cut and run? On February 1st, amidst mounting congressional consideration, Reagan approved the idea of redeploying Marines, but did not set a date for doing so. Almost immediately afterward, however, pro-Syrian militias overran West Beirut, and on February 7th, Reagan announced that the Marines would withdraw offshore. Terrorist attacks, a lack of diplomatic progress, and congressional opposition led Reagan to his decision. Meanwhile, Operation Moses takes place, and that would be in Ethiopia. On November 18th, the Israeli Defense Force launched Operation Moses, a 7-week covert operation, airlifting thousands of Ethiopian Jews in refugee camps to safety in Israel. While the Jewish community in Ethiopia has a rich Jewish history dating back well over 2,000 years, by the mid-1980s, as the community was endangered by the Ethiopian Civil War and widespread famine. Gandhi, India, assassinated. If I die today, every drop of my blood will invigorate the nation. She was the second longest, Indira Gandhi was the second longest serving prime minister of India, and the daughter of the country's first prime minister. She became a prime minister in 1966. She led India to a major victory over Pakistan in the 1971 war. She was ousted because of corruption in 1977, but in 1980, she rose back to popularity and became prime minister again. Gandhi struggled to navigate the India's intense divisions, which came to a head when she ordered an army raid on the Sikh temple as the strike against Sikh extremists. A pair of her bodyguards, both Sikh, put their religion first and on October 31st, assassinated Gandhi. Over the next 4 days, 8,000 Sikhs were killed in retaliatory violence. It is time to say goodbye to Ma Bell, American Telephone and Telegraph Company, Bell System, and associated companies. 1974, the U.S. Justice Department filed an antitrust lawsuit against AT&T based on complaints by MCI and other long-distance service providers. The lawsuit went unresolved for 8 years. But in 1982, the company settled with the government under conditions ordered by Judge Harold H. Green of the Federal District Court for the District of Columbia. On January 1st, AT&T, the once unified Bell telephone system, began life as 8 separate companies. After being busted up by the government, AT&T kept the long-distance business, equipment manufacturing operations at Bell Laboratories, and was free to enter new businesses such as computers. The local operating companies became 7 independent-owned regional holding companies, mainly engaged in providing local telephone service. You probably, well, some of you might remember NYNEX here in the New York area, Pacific Telesis, Armatech, that was in the South, Bell Atlantic, Southwestern Bell Corporation, Bell South, and US West were the new companies. The Apple Macintosh, there it is. It was released to the market on January 24th. It was the first personal computer that gained commercial success. Had a beige case consisting of a number 9 in a CRT monitor and came with a keyboard and mouse. It played a pivotal role in establishing desktop publishing as a general office function. A handle built into the top of the case made it easier for the computer to be lifted and carried. It had an initial selling price of $2,495 US, equivalent to $6,215 in 2020. Bit expensive. In fact, it was pretty expensive. Well, here's Margaret Thatcher, and she's rebounding in popularity in Britain. The British coal miners' strike. On March 6th, the main strike started with a walkout at Cortland Wood Colliery. The government strategy designed by Margaret Thatcher was threefold. Build up ample coal supplies to keep as many miners at work as possible, and use the police to break up attacks by pickets on working miners. Strike was ruled illegal in September. There was no national ballot of the National Union of Mine Workers members, so it was illegal. The Bhopal chemical disaster was the world's worst industrial disaster. It is December 2nd. An accident at the Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released at least 30 tons of highly toxic gas, leading to more than 600,000 people being exposed to a deadly gas cloud. Estimates of the death toll vary, few as 3,800, maybe as many as 16,000. AIDS. AIDS is a big deal. It's a totally big deal. Let's see what's going on here in chat here. 9-inch should be changed to 9-inch. Okay, no problem. Thanks, Zoe. Anyway, HIV. It's April 23rd. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Margaret Heckler announced that the National Cancer Institute's Dr. Robert Gallo and his colleagues found the cause of AIDS, a retrovirus they labeled HTLV-3, which would eventually be renamed for the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. On July 13th, the U.S. Center for Disease Control states that avoiding injection drug use and reducing needle sharing should also be effective in preventing transmission of the virus. Okay, I know a lot about this, an awful lot about it, because this is my business. American cable TV. That is ESPN, which was on the ropes going into 1984, along with CNN. CNN was losing millions of dollars a month. ESPN more than likely would have failed without government intervention. Like many other cable networks in the 1970s and 80s, it lost a lot of money. Cable TV operators were in control. The multiple system operators worked deals with cable networks and then passed the price increases on to consumers. The Gipper, he did play George Gipp once, right? He also played Grover Cleveland Alexander in a movie about, for whatever reason, Hollywood decided to do a movie about the 1926 World Series, and he played Grover Cleveland Alexander, and he struck out Tony Lazzeri of the Yankees. And Grover Cleveland Alexander was an old drunk who was with the St. Louis Cardinals, and the Cardinals won the World Series, and he played Grover Cleveland Alexander. Anyway, the United States Congress would pass the Cable TV Act of 1984, and Reagan would sign the bill. The legislation would create a real basic extended tier that subscribers would have to take as a whole, or not, and pay for every channel on that tier if they chose to buy the package. Reagan and cable TV. The law allowed cable TV operators to bundle what were financially faltering networks, and every one of them was faltering. Whether it was ESPN or CNN or the Weather Channel, they were all in bad shape. Into a basic expanded tier, which may have saved the cable industry as consumers were paying one flat fee for numerous stations on basic expanded. And those stations like ESPN would eventually become the most costly, or for you as a consumer, that would be the highest channel you paid for, except you never saw it. You never saw a bill. What you saw back in those days was you either paid for basic or you paid for basic or expanded basic. And what was going on was those in the New York area, non-channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, that was thrown into the local basic. The basic expanded had all those other networks, and you never saw how much you were paying. You're paying well over $7 for ESPN today, but you would never know it because you never see it on the bill. It's just one flat bill. They never itemized it. The bundling of channels would lead to the formation of regional cable TV sports networks around the United States, also very expensive, strengthened ESPN, CNN, and other Ted Turner properties and other cable TV networks. Regional sports cable channels would soon be able to pay more money for events than local over-the-air channels. The sports channels would have two sources of income: subscriber fees, advertising support, which was not on over-the-air TV. Bernie Getz, you might remember Bernie Getz. Those were the days. WNEW Radio. I actually did work for WNEW Radio, and that's Warren Levison behind the AP microphone there, the guy with the bald head. Warren Levinson, New York. Anyway, Bernie Getz. It's December 22nd, and Bernie Getz is a Queens, New York native who owned an electronics business. He boards a Manhattan subway. Soon afterwards, he pulled out a gun and shot the man who he claimed was trying to rob him. Getz then fled the scene. Drove to Vermont. He buried the gun. The men all survived that he shot the shooting, although one was seriously injured. On December 31st, Bernie Getz turned himself into New Hampshire police. By the way, that is my father-in-law, and that is Michael Jordan. Take a good look at top of Michael Jordan's head. He has hair. Kevin Loughery was Michael Jordan's coach with the National Basketball Association Chicago Bulls in 1984. This was his assessment after watching him for a day or two. We know he was going to be good, but we never thought he was going to be the greatest player ever to play. In all honesty, on the second day training camp, we knew we had a special player. We felt he was a decent shooter. When we saw his ability to handle the ball and his athletic ability, when we saw all of that, we knew he was going to be something special. But then again, we never thought he was going to be the greatest player of all time. And I did that interview with Kevin Loggery, who coached Julius Erving with the New York Nets when they were in the American Basketball Association. And he thought to that point that Julius was the greatest player ever. Michael Jordan's presence, though, in Chicago didn't do much for the win-loss record, but it did do good at the box office. The Chicago Bulls franchise went from an average of 6,300 65 per game to 11,887. But more importantly, for the NBA, Michael Jordan, and this is where his reputation is made. It's not made on the basketball court. It is made by the massive marketing machinery created by Nike. He was brought into the living room. Be like Mike, drink Gatorade, all that other stuff. And he became very likable, perceived perception. You don't know what he's really like, but you like him on TV, so he must be a good guy, even though you don't really know why you like him. But that's the power of advertising. The Bulls won only 55 games in the 2 years before Jordan arrived. With Jordan, they were 38-44, and Kevin Loggery was fired. There she is, Miss America. Yeah, there she is, Miss America, Vanessa Williams. She was the first African American to win the title, Miss America, in 1983. I miss Burt Parks. Burt Parks was Mr. America, singing Miss America. Anyway, remember Johnny Carson when they fired Burt Parks, the Atlantic City pageant people? Johnny Carson went on every night trying to get Burt Parks back, and they didn't listen to him. They brought in younger people, Gary Collins, whatever. Anyway, Vanessa Williams also became the first winner in the pageant's 63-year history to resign the crown after the news broke that nude photos of her in sexually explicit positions with another woman would be published in the September issue of Penthouse. The photographer didn't live too far from here. She got like $200 for it. Suzette Charles was given the crown on July 23rd as the Miss America organizers decided it was best to get rid of Williams. I'm going to give you a story here, a quick story. I dated a woman by the name of Charlene Anelick in 1978. She was Miss Rockland County, New York. And she competed in the state pageant. And we were talking one day. I was a young newspaper guy. I was 23 years old. I said, I'm doing a story on you. And I said, I want to know what it's like to be exploited. In her case, she wanted to win a college scholarship, which really didn't matter because her father was an assistant district attorney in Manhattan. She went up to Boston University. And she said, well, this is what it was about. You got to impress these lecherous old men who actually ran the pageant. And the pageant is basically about winning a college scholarship. So she said that I could go from 34B to 36C in a matter of a couple seconds. I could stuff my butt. And I could put Vaseline on my teeth because for whatever reason, when you put your lips over the Vaseline, you always come out smiling. And she also discussed how, and she looked at me, she said, what size shoe you take? I said, a 12. She said, nah, that's no good. I said, what do you mean it's no good? She said, I want you to do, the walk down the runway. And she showed me that there's a special way that you had to walk down the runway. So this is a group that exploited people for a college scholarship, and yet they're very upset with Vanessa Williams. Charlene actually won Miss Rockland 2 years in a row because 1 year there was no competition. But she went up to Rochester. It was an experience, and that was the end of that. The photos had been taken 2 years before Williams was named Miss America, when she worked briefly as a makeup artist and receptionist for a little-known Mount Kisco photographer. Penthouse sold 6 million copies of the issue, made about $14 million for the company. Williams responded by telling People magazine, I'm not a lesbian, I'm not a slut, and somehow I'm going to make people believe me. I guess she did, didn't she? It took a while, but she did. Ghostbusters! Who are you going to call? Ghostbusters was a supernatural comedy film directed and produced by Ivan Reitman and written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis. Stars Bill Murray, Aykroyd, and Ramis as Peter Venkman, Ray Stantz, and Egon Spengler, three eccentric parapsychologists who start a ghost-catching business in New York City. It was released on January 8th. The film earned $282.2 million during its initial theatrical run, making it the second highest grossing film of the year in the United States and Canada. I'll be back. Well, that was number one. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator. A human soldier is sent from 2029 to 1984 to stop an almost indestructible cyborg killing machine, set from the same year, which has been programmed to execute a young woman whose unborn son is the key to humanity's future salvation. Arnold Schwarzenegger established himself as an action superstar with this movie. Terminator topped the United States box office for 2 weeks, eventually earning $78.3 million against a modest $6.4 million budget. Oh, and if you wanted to, say, tape, this was on HBO, either one of those movies, if you wanted to tape it, you didn't have to worry about being busted because the VHS is legal. On January 17th, a divided Supreme Court overruled the U.S. Ninth Circuit of, let's try that again, overruled the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and declared that Sony could continue to sell its Betamax videocassette recorders despite the objections of two large Hollywood studios, Universal and Disney. Until the Supreme Court decision, there was a question whether consumer electronic companies would even be allowed to sell such devices. You can tape it now. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote the majority opinion in the Sony Court of America versus Universal case. Even if people copied an entire show, it wasn't an infringement if they were doing so to watch the program later. This is Jeopardy! Now, Jeopardy had been on between 1964 and 1977 on NBC, and Merv Griffin came up with it out of the game show Scandals. And he was a host of Play Your Hunch, on which was a Goodson Todman show. I think it was on NBC. And he decided he wanted to do his own game show. But he didn't know how to do it. If it was a quiz show, he was worried about how would people accuse him of supplying answers to people. So he's on the flight from Minneapolis to New York with his wife at the time, Julianne, and he's expressing his concerns. And she says to him, Merv, just give them the answers. Let them come up with the questions. That's it. It was that simple. But that wasn't an original idea. It was on radio in 1941, a very similar show, but I don't think they remembered it. But there is Alex Trebek, who was on the show for well more than 37 years as the host. The daily syndicated version debuted on September 10th and was launched in response to the success of the syndicated version of Wheel of Fortune and the installation of electronic trivia games in pubs and bars. Now, in the New York area, Channel 7, WABC, started this thing out at 3 o'clock in the morning. Let me say one thing about Lucille Ball, because you're going to read this. Jeopardy creator Merv Griffin was encouraged to hire Alex Trebek by Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball was, she was a game show fanatic. She also knew talent. She knew talent inside out. For instance, she discovered Rod Serling. She also greenlighted the Eliot Ness books, The Untouchables at Desilu. She was also the only one who believed in this Gene Roddenberry science fiction show, Star Trek. Everybody else said, get away from it. You're going to lose too much money. No, you can't do it. You can't do it. You can't do it. She said, it's my company, Desilu. I want it done. NBC said no to the first pilot. They said, but come back with that guy with the funny ears, the Martian, where no man has ever gone before. Who was right? She knew talent inside out. So Alex Trebek, Lucy says to Merv, hire Alex Trebek. Trebek shot 2 pilots for the revival of Jeopardy when the original host, Art Fleming, who happened to be a friend of Trebek, declined to return to the role, owing it to creative differences. He thought it was a legitimate quiz show, and this Jeopardy was a TV show. This revival sold. Trebek began hosting it in 1984 and remained the host until his death. And then there was this show, Press Your Luck, on CBS with Peter Tamarkin. On May 19th, before a live studio audience for the game show Press Your Luck, a squirrely-looking, gray-bearded 35-year-old man by the name of Michael Larson leapt from behind his podium and squealed with joy. He gamed the game. He won $104,950 in cash, a sailboat worth more than $1,000, 2 trips, his total winnings more than $110,000. Something was very wrong. Here's this guy from nowhere, and he kept going around the board and hitting bonus boxes every time. It was bedlam, I could tell you, and we couldn't stop this guy. This was Michael Brockman, head of the CBS daytime programming department. He did nothing wrong. Larson cracked the code to Press Your Luck. For months, he studied the show's game board, which lit up squares in a supposedly random sequence, and found that in actuality, it was repeating the same 5 patterns over and over and over again. After Larson's win, the big board was reprogrammed. Larson didn't break any rules. They even wanted to have him arrested. For what? He figured it out. It's their fault. Not a bad tip. No. This is not a bad tip at all. This is a diner in Yonkers, New York. In March, a New York police detective by the name of Robert Cunningham dined at Sal's Pizzeria in Yonkers, where Phyllis Penzo waited tables 6 nights a week for a while for a slice. Cunningham was about to settle the tab on his usual meal of linguine and clam sauce when, on impulse, he offered Phyllis a deal. Instead of giving me a tip or giving you a tip, I got a lottery ticket in my pocket. Why don't we split the card? Penzo sat down, helped Cunningham choose the numbers for his $1 entry in the New York State Lotto competition. On April Fool's Day, April 1st, Cunningham called Penzo at 9 a.m. to tell her he had just won $6 million. Remember, this is April Fool's Day, and that she was entitled to half of it. I'm still asleep, she remembers. I said, don't bother me now. Cunningham convinced her it was not an April Fool's Day joke. She screamed. She woke up her husband, Robert, the construction worker, to tell him they were rich. The 2 families would split the lottery payout of $285,000 a year, or $286,000 a year over the next 21 years. Don't they know it's Christmas? Band-Aid. Series of television reports highlighting the famine in Ethiopia, which began in 1983, shocked the UK once they were aired. Charities such as Save the Children were inundated with requests from the public to help millions of stricken children. Bob Geldof and his then wife, Paula Yates, too, were deeply affected by what they saw and were driven to aid the crisis in any way they could. Midge Ure met Geldof, and they agreed to work together on a charity record. Geldof then called every contact he had, and they pulled plenty of strings to assemble musicians that were featured on the track, Do They Know It's Christmas? Do they know it's Christmas reached number 1. Stayed there for 5 weeks over the 1984 Christmas holidays, raising a total of £8 million within 12 weeks of its release. You must be 21 to drink in the U.S. I grew up in Rockland County in New York, and the New Jersey kids used to come over because it was 18 in New York, 21 in New Jersey, and the same thing in Westchester. The Connecticut kids would come over. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984 required all states to raise their minimum purchase in public possession of all alcohol aged to 21. States that did not comply faced a reduction in highway funds under the Federal Highway Aid Act. So, going back, taking a look at 1984, Reagan wins by a landslide. GOP gained strength in the House. China and the United Kingdom stuck to their 1984 agreement, and at midnight, July 1st, 1987, Hong Kong became part of China. On June 30, 2020, China introduced the national security law in Hong Kong in response to massive pro-democracy protests that swept through the city the previous year. The law reduces Hong Kong's judicial autonomy and makes it easier to punish demonstrators and activists. The computer became essential in daily lives. AT&T is bigger than ever. In 2005, SBC purchased its former parent, AT&T Corp, and took on its branding, with the merged entity naming itself AT&T Inc. and using its history a version of its iconic logo, stock trading symbol, which launched on December 30th, 2005. Four of the seven Baby Bells are now part of today's AT&T. On October 22nd, AT&T announced the deal to buy Time Warner for $108.7 billion in an effort to increase its media holdings. In April 2022, Discovery took control of HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers, creating a new media giant, buying AT&T, and they are running that into the ground. They are absolutely running that into the ground right now, Discovery people. Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. Soviet Union fell in 1991. The Iran-Iraq War ended in 1998. Iraq would invade Kuwait in 1989. That started the first Gulf War in 1990. The Second Persian Gulf War would start in 2003. Saddam Hussein would be executed in 2006. The Lebanon Civil War lasted more than 15 years, from 1975 through 1990. In Bhopal, the toxic material remains, and many of those who are exposed to the gas have given birth to physically and mentally disabled children. For decades, survivors have been fighting to have the site cleaned up, but they say the efforts slowed down when the Michigan-based Dow Chemical took over Union Carbide in 2001. Human rights groups say that thousands of tons of hazardous waste remain buried underground, and the government has conceded the area is contaminated. In England, the miners' strike ended after 1 year in 1985. The miners' defeat significantly weakened the English trade union movement. Margaret Thatcher broke the union, but it came at a cost. Poverty increased in former coal mining areas, and in 1994, Grimethorpe in South Yorkshire was the poorest settlement in the country. From 1987 to 1989, the U.S. Navy intervened in the tanker war on the side of Iraq, attacking Iranian oil platforms after a U.S.-flagged Kuwaiti tanker, MV Sea Isle City, was attacked by the Iranian Navy, and later destroying several Iranian ships in retaliation for the Iranian mining of the USS Samuel B. Roberts. The war resulted in the damaging of 586 commercial vessels and the killing of 430 civilian sailors. There she is. That's a backward picture, I see. Anyway, there is Vanessa Williams. She ultimately became a star entertainer. She ended up getting a Grammy, Emmy, Tony nominations for her work. Michael Jordan was one of the greatest NBA players ever. Arnold Schwarzenegger announced his candidacy in the 2003 California recall election for governor of California on the August 6, 2003 episode of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. There were politicians who went on late-night talk shows to announce their candidacy. Arnold was the first. On October 7th, Schwarzenegger was elected governor of California. The video home system ruling allowed recordings of TV shows, and now video on demand is a commonplace. There is Alex Trebek, there is Jeopardy, and they had a problem replacing Alex on Jeopardy. Jeopardy remains one of Sony TV's hottest properties. 2015, the Library of Congress selected Ghostbusters to preserve in the National Film Registry. 1987, the Manhattan grand jury acquitted Bernhard Goetz of criminal assault and attempted murder. However, he was convicted on weapons charges for carrying a gun without a license, spent 8 months in jail. Bernie Goetz would run for mayor of New York City in 2001. And that was the year that was, 1984.
We'll see everybody again on
See
the
you in a couple
next
of
lecture.
weeks.
Yep, and thank you, Evan, for putting together a, 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 a memorable presentation as usual. Lots of memories in that, and we'll see you again.
Yeah, see you in a
Till
couple of
then,
weeks.
have a great evening.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.